Grave Robbing for God, the dark history of early medical anatomy and faith. It is midnight in a Scottish churchyard in the early 19th century. The air is bitterly cold, thick with fog and the smell of damp earth. Two men slip over the stone wall, carrying a pair of wooden shovels, a dark lantern, and a thick coil of rope. They move quietly past the older, weathered tombstones and head straight for a patch of freshly turned soil. A burial took place here just hours ago. They don't dig up the entire grave. That takes too long. Instead, they dig a precise square hole at the head of the grave. They use wooden shovels, because metal striking stone makes too much noise in the dead of night. When they reach the wooden coffin, they use a heavy iron crowbar to snap the lid just over the head of the deceased. They slip the rope under the corpse's arms, brace themselves against the edge of the pit, and heave the dead weight out of the ground. They strip the corpse entirely naked, tossing the burial shroud back into the hole. They aren't doing this to be unnecessarily cruel. They are doing it because of a bizarre, highly specific, legal loophole. Under British law at the time, a human body, once dead, cannot be owned by anyone. Therefore, stealing a corpse is only a minor misdemeanor. But stealing the clothes on the corpse? That is a felony, punishable by transportation to a penal colony, or even execution. They shove the naked body into a canvas sack, shovel the dirt back into the hole, smooth it over so it looks untouched, and vanish into the fog. Before the sun rises, that sack will be delivered to the back door of a prestigious medical school, and the man who pays them for it, in cold, hard cash, no questions asked, will not be a mobster or a serial killer. He will be a respected, highly educated, and deeply religious doctor. Welcome to History Unlayered. I'm your host, Holy Timelines. Today, we are opening the doors of the anatomical theater. We are going to look at the murky, bloody, and morally terrifying origins of modern medicine. We are asking, how did the pursuit of healing become intertwined with the ultimate desecration? And how did early scientists justify committing a profound religious taboo in order to study what they believed was God's greatest masterpiece? Today, we are exploring the dark history of early medical anatomy, the resurrection men, and grave robbing for God. To understand why grave robbing became a massive, lucrative, and absolutely essential industry in the 18th and 19th centuries, we first have to understand the profound theological terror that surrounded the act of dissection. For the modern person, donating your body to science is viewed as a noble, altruistic act. But for the vast majority of human history, cutting open a human body was considered an absolute abomination. In ancient Greece and Rome, the body was heavily tabooed after death. Even the great ancient physician Galen, whose medical texts were treated as unquestionable gospel for over 1,000 years, never dissected a human being. He based his entire anatomical understanding of the human body on the dissection of Barbary macaques, dogs, and pigs. Because of this, his textbooks were riddled with massive, fundamental errors about human anatomy. But no one knew, because no one was legally or religiously allowed to look inside a human. When Christianity became the dominant religion of Europe, this taboo did not disappear. In fact, it intensified, anchored by a core theological concept, the doctrine of bodily resurrection. Early Christians and medieval believers took the idea of resurrection very literally. They believed that upon the day of judgment, Christ would return, the trumpets would sound, and the graves would literally open. But crucially, they believed you needed your physical, intact body to be resurrected. God would knit the bones and the flesh back together. Therefore, the body was not just an empty shell to be discarded. It was a sacred vessel resting in consecrated ground, waiting to be reactivated, to be dissected, to have your chest sawed open, your organs removed, your skin flayed, and your parts scattered in a medical school was a terrifying prospect. To the medieval and early modern mind, it meant you might be denied entry into the kingdom of heaven. It meant your resurrection was permanently compromised. Because of this intense theological dread, the church and the state completely forbade the dissection of everyday citizens. But as the centuries crept on and the Renaissance blossomed, a new breed of doctors began to realize a terrifying truth. Galen was wrong. The ancient medical texts were flawed. People were dying on the operating table from easily treatable injuries because doctors fundamentally did not know where the organs were, how the blood flowed, or how the nervous system functioned. In the 16th century, an anatomist named Andreas Vesalius began to quietly, secretly dissect human bodies. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. It was a masterpiece. It contained highly accurate, beautifully illustrated maps of the human skeleton, the musculature, and the vascular system. Vesalius proved that the only way to understand the human body was to cut it open. But Vesalius and the anatomists who followed him were not atheists trying to tear down religion. They were deeply pious men. They viewed their work through a theological lens. They argued that the human body was God's ultimate creation, the pinnacle of divine engineering. To study the human body was not an insult to God, it was the highest form of worship. It was studying the architecture of the divine. They argued that ignorance was the true sin. How could you truly marvel at the Creator if you refuse to understand the magnificent complexity of His creation? But this noble theological justification ran headfirst into a massive, unsolvable problem: the supply chain. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the study of medicine had exploded. Cities like London, Paris, and Edinburgh became global hubs for medical education. Hundreds of eager medical students were enrolling every year. And to graduate, every single one of those students needed to perform a dissection. They needed bodies. Thousands of them. And they needed them fast. We have to remember that this was long before the invention of chemical preservatives like formaldehyde, and long before electric refrigeration. When a body arrived at the medical school, the clock was ticking. In the heat of summer, a body would putrefy and become entirely useless and biologically dangerous to the students in a matter of days. Because of this, anatomy could only be taught during the bitter cold of winter. The winter months became known as the, quote, anatomy season. The dissection rooms were horrific places, freezing cold, reeking of decay, and lit by flickering gas lamps. But the cold slowed the decomposition just enough for the students to work. This meant the entire annual demand for cadavers was compressed into just a few freezing months, putting unimaginable pressure on the supply chain. But where could they legally get them? The law was incredibly strict. In Britain, under the Murder Act of 1752, the only bodies legally allowed to be used for medical dissection were those of executed murderers. Think about the psychological weight of that law. Dissection was literally a post-mortem punishment. It was a terror tactic used by the state. The message was clear. If you commit the ultimate crime of murder, you will not only be hanged until dead, but we will deny you a sacred burial. We will give your body to the surgeons to be carved into pieces. Dissection was legally codified as a fate worse than death. But here was the morbid math problem. The medical schools of Britain needed roughly 1,000 bodies a winter to train their students. But the courts only executed about 50 murderers a year. The demand vastly, catastrophically outstripped the legal supply. And whenever there is a massive demand for an illegal product, a black market will inevitably rise to fill the void. Enter the Resurrection Men. Also known as body snatchers, the Resurrection Men were organized gangs of criminals who realized that a fresh corpse was essentially buried treasure. The medical schools were willing to pay incredibly high prices for fresh cadavers, sometimes the equivalent of several months' wages for a working-class man, just for a single night's work. Grave robbing became an epidemic. It was a booming, highly sophisticated underground industry. The gangs had spies inside the churches and hospitals, tipping them off to who had died, when they were being buried, and where the grave was located. They even had macabre side hustles. Before delivering the body to the anatomist, the Resurrection Men would often pry the teeth out of the corpse's mouth. Human teeth were highly prized by dentists to make dentures for the wealthy. During this era, dentures made from the teeth of the dead were commonly referred to as Waterloo teeth, named after the horrific looting of the dead soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo. The commodification of the human body was absolute. And this is where the profound moral cognitive dissonance of the era becomes truly staggering. Inside the bright intellectual halls of the medical schools, you had the most educated, respected, and pious men in society. These doctors took the Hippocratic Oath. They went to church on Sundays. They genuinely believed their anatomical research was saving lives and glorifying God. But to do that research, these same doctors had to walk to the back door of the anatomy theater at 2 a.m, hand a pouch of gold to a violent, hardened criminal, and accept a burlap sack containing the stolen body of a grandmother, a child, or a beloved husband who had been buried just hours before. The doctors knew exactly where the bodies were coming from. They knew they were funding a massive criminal enterprise that was terrorizing the public. They knew they were inflicting unimaginable psychological trauma on grieving families who would wake up to find their loved ones' graves empty. How did they justify it? They utilized a psychological mechanism we see time and time again in history. The ends justify the means. The doctors believed that the knowledge contained inside that stolen corpse could save 100 living patients. They believed that to stop dissecting meant a return to the dark ages of medicine. They viewed the temporary grief of the family as an unfortunate, necessary sacrifice on the altar of medical progress. Perhaps no one embodied this chilling arrogance more than the famous Scottish surgeon John Hunter, widely considered the father of modern surgery. Hunter was obsessed with anatomy. He wanted to collect every human anomaly he could find. In 1783, a man named Charles Byrne famous as the Irish Giant because he was over 7 feet tall, was dying in London. Byrne was terrified of John Hunter. He knew Hunter wanted his body for his museum. On his deathbed, Byrne begged his friends to put his body in a lead coffin and bury him deep at sea, far away from the surgeon's knives. But Hunter's wealth and obsession won. He bribed the undertaker with a massive sum of money, roughly equivalent to $50,000 today. When the coffin was lowered into the sea, it was full of heavy rocks. Hunter already had Charles Byrne's body boiling in a vat in his basement to extract the skeleton. To this day, against his explicit dying wishes, Charles Byrne's skeleton remains on display at the Hunterian Museum in London. The public was absolutely terrified of men like John Hunter and the grave robbers they employed. A profound, sweeping paranoia gripped the nation. Death was no longer a peaceful rest. It was a race against the resurrection men. Families would mount armed guards in the graveyard for weeks after a burial, standing watch with shotguns in the freezing winter until the body was decomposed enough to be useless to the anatomists. The wealthy invested in bizarre, extreme security measures. They bought mort safes, massive, heavy cages made of solid iron that were bolted down over the grave to prevent digging. You can still see these rusted iron cages in old Scottish graveyards today. They bought heavy, lead-lined coffins. They built high watchtowers in the center of cemeteries, manned by armed guards with lanterns. But the poor could not afford iron cages or armed guards. The poor were buried in shallow graves, in cheap wooden boxes, in overcrowded urban churchyards. The burden of this medical black market fell almost entirely on the destitute and the vulnerable. The doctors were learning to heal the rich by carving up the stolen bodies of the poor, and this simmering class warfare often exploded into literal violence. This wasn't just a British problem, it was global. In 1788, in New York City, a group of children were playing outside the New York hospital. One of the medical students reportedly waved a severed arm out the window at them to scare them. One of the boys went home and told his father, whose wife had recently died. The father went to the graveyard, found his wife's grave empty, and an absolute bloodbath ensued. Thousands of furious New Yorkers stormed the hospital, dragging doctors into the streets, burning their medical collections, and engaging in a 3-day riot that had to be put down by the state militia, leaving several people dead. It was known as the Doctors Riot. The public was pushed to the absolute breaking point. And then, inevitably, the black market reached its darkest, most horrific logical conclusion back in Britain. If a fresh corpse is worth a small fortune, and digging them out of the frozen ground in the middle of the night is hard, dangerous work, why wait for them to die? Why not create your own supply? This grim realization led to the infamous crimes of William Burke and William Hare in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1828. Burke and Hare were not grave robbers. They were serial killers. They realized that the medical schools, specifically the school run by the brilliant and highly respected anatomist Dr. Robert Knox, were asking zero questions about where the bodies came from. So Burke and Hare began luring vulnerable, marginalized people, prostitutes, the elderly, the disabled, the homeless, into their boarding house. They would get them drunk, suffocate them to avoid leaving physical marks of violence, a method that came to be known as burking, and then wheel their fresh, perfectly preserved bodies straight to Dr. Knox's dissection table. They murdered 16 people over the course of 10 months. And Dr. Knox bought every single one of them. Did Dr. Knox know they were murdered? History heavily debates this. The bodies were incredibly fresh, and the victims were often well-known figures from the local streets. Many historians argue that a brilliant anatomist would absolutely know the difference between someone who died of natural disease and someone who had been asphyxiated hours prior. But Dr. Knox asked no questions. The anatomical data was too valuable. The pursuit of scientific truth had completely blinded him to the moral horror happening in his own dissection room. When Burke and Hare were finally caught, the public outcry was deafening. The scandal sent shockwaves through the entire British Empire. William Burke was hanged, and in a dark, poetic twist of irony, his sentence dictated that his body be publicly dissected by the medical school. You can still see a pocketbook bound in William Burke's tanned skin in the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh today. But the Burke and Hare murders forced the government to finally reckon with the monster they had created. The legal restriction on using only executed murderers had failed spectacularly. The medical schools had to be supplied legally, or the murders, the riots, and the grave robbing would never stop. This crisis led to the Anatomy Act of 1832. The Anatomy Act fundamentally changed the landscape of medical science, effectively ending the era of the resurrection men overnight. But the solution the government chose was, in many ways, just as morally chilling as the problem it solved. The Anatomy Act decreed that medical schools could legally take the bodies of anyone who died unclaimed by a relative. On paper, this sounds reasonable, but in the reality of 19th century Victorian Britain, who dies unclaimed? The answer: the absolute poorest members of society. The homeless, the mentally ill, the orphans, and, most significantly, the inmates of the brutal Victorian workhouses. If you were destitute, sick, and had no family who could afford to pay for your burial, the state would quietly transfer your body to the anatomy theaters. The terrifying post-mortem punishment of dissection, which for centuries had been reserved exclusively for the worst murderers in society, was now the legal penalty for the simple crime of being poor. The Anatomy Act didn't remove the theological dread of dissection. It simply shifted the burden of that dread entirely onto the working class. It created a deep, lingering mistrust of the medical establishment among the poor, a profound fear of the hospital, a fear of the surgeon's knife, a generational trauma that echoed for decades. So where does this leave us? How do we contextualize this dark, blood-soaked chapter of human history? Today, you can walk into a bright, sterile hospital and undergo a life-saving surgery. The surgeon operating on you knows exactly where every nerve, every artery, and every vital organ is located. They know this because centuries of anatomical maps have been painstakingly drawn, refined, and perfected. But those maps were not drawn in a vacuum. They were drawn in dimly lit, freezing cellars, in the dead of night, using stolen bodies. The foundation of modern medical science, the very knowledge that saves our lives, cures our diseases, and heals our children, was built on a massive, systemic violation of the most sacred religious and cultural taboos of the ancient world. The anatomists of the 18th and 19th centuries lived in a profound state of cognitive dissonance. They believed they were honoring God by exploring the miraculous machinery of the human body. They believed they were performing a vital, noble service for humanity. But to do so, they had to fund an underworld of ghouls, criminals, and sometimes murderers. They had to shatter the peace of the dead to save the living. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about progress. We like to think of scientific advancement as a clean, steady, upward march toward the light. But history shows us that the pursuit of truth is often incredibly messy. It requires people to step into the moral gray areas, to cross boundaries, and to break the rules of their own era. We owe an incalculable debt of gratitude to the brilliance and the relentless curiosity of those early anatomists. But we owe an equally profound, tragic debt to the thousands of nameless, forgotten people, the grave robbed, the murdered, the unclaimed poor, and people like Charles Byrne, whose bodies became the raw material for our modern miracles. They were the unwilling pioneers of modern medicine. The next time you look at a medical textbook or marvel at the complexity of the human heart, remember the resurrection men. Remember the iron cages rusting in the Scottish graveyards. Remember that the knowledge of the divine blueprint was purchased at a terrifying human cost. Thanks for listening to History Unlayered. I'm Holy Timelines. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the obvious, and keep digging